right, why don't we get this kicked off? Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining today. My name is Bobby Keeler, and I'm the CEO and co-founder here at Elion. We're really excited to have you all join us today for what promises to be a great discussion on interoperability and what you need to know as a digital health provider organization. Just real quick, for those of you who haven't heard of Elion, our goal is really to make it easier to create great healthcare companies by giving builders the information and insights they need to make better decisions about their tech stack. And so if you haven't already, definitely come check us out at elion.health. And yeah, just real quick too, before we start this session off, we just wanted to do a quick one-question poll to get an understanding of where folks are in their interoperability journey. So this should be coming through here in just a moment. Great, so we'll give folks just a second to answer that. Awesome. And while we're just getting that wrapped up, why don't we just start doing some introduction? So Ali, I'll pass it over to you if you don't mind just quickly introducing yourself.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Alexandra Cohen. I'm the VP of Product at Redesign Health. I've spent the last 15 years or so working on problems in interoperability across healthcare, from the New York eHealth Collaborative, building the backend infrastructure for the statewide health information network of New York, then moving on to the vendor side, working at Particle Health, and now really working on the side of digital health operators at Redesign Health, helping our opcos stand up their own solutions.
Great, thanks, Ali. Brendan, you want to do a quick intro?
Yeah, hey everyone, I'm Brendan Keeler, based out of Portland, Oregon. I am the head of product for Flexpa, Flexible Patient Access. Previously, I've worked at Epic, the behemoth, and then Redox, integration company, and Zeus Health, interoperability company. And on the side, I write Health API Guy sporadically, a healthcare newsletter.
Awesome. I never knew that's what Flexpa stood for. All right, just learned something. Samir, over to you.
Hey folks, my name is Samir Jain. I currently lead EHR solutions for Medidata Solutions, which is really focused on clinical trials and clinical trial enablement. Have been in the interoperability world for almost 18 years now, really starting off working at MySys and Allscripts, building EHRs that were interoperable and owning the interoperability strategy for them, and then eventually moved on to building large-scale health information exchanges, leading the clinical platforms team for Teladoc for a while, and most recently, prior to Medidata, leading the product team at Redesign. So pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Bobby.
Great. Okay, we'll end the poll. I think I can share the results out. Looks like the majority of folks are here learning and educating themselves. So hopefully this will be helpful for that. So why don't we dive right in? And Brendan, I'll start with you and maybe just a quick definition. So first, just what is interoperability in the context of a digital health provider organization?
Well, interoperability is a kind of a shitty catch-all, is the way I would describe it. It's this broad superset of, I'm an organization. There are other organizations with which I do things with, or other entities. And how do I exchange data back and forth? So if you break it down into specific workflows and the workflows that are being solved, you start to get a better picture of interoperability, because it's really easy to suddenly say, like, how is Redox different than Particle, different than OneUp, different than DoseSpot? And realistically, they are solving different interoperability workflows. So at any time there's these handoffs that used to be on paper, they used to be a phone call, and they're digitized, it's a new interoperability workflow. So it's that enterprise exchange between enterprises that's the real interoperability. There's also things like integration. So within my enterprise, how do I stitch all my systems together? You can lump that into interoperability. I don't. I really think that as a digital health provider organization, you need to figure that out for sure. But the biggest interoperability problems, and most of the interoperability companies position themselves to help you solve, how do I send an e-prescription to pharmacies? How do I send labs? How do I do eligibility? How do I get clinical data? History is the big one that most people converge on, but all of those are interoperability problems, and that superset, is how we get confused.
Got it. Helpful. So let's put it then in the context of digital health provider orgs. And Ali, maybe over to you. So let's say I'm just starting to build a digital health provider organization. How do I start to figure out what my interoperability needs are?
I think building exactly on what Brendan just said, it really depends on your specific workflow and really understanding who the patient population that you're trying to serve is, where they might have information outside of your system, and then what you're doing for them. So asking yourself or asking your company or your providers the types of questions: do you actually need a patient's full history, or do you only need to understand what prescriptions they've had? What does the patient actually know about themselves? And what do you know about them? So do you have a small amount of data? You have their name and zip code. That might be very different if you have an actual list of the providers that they've seen before. What condition are you treating them for? Are you a PCP who's going to get to know them and you really need to know all of the information about them going back 20 years? Or are you seeing them for an ear infection or conjunctivitis when all you really need to know is, are they allergic to amoxicillin? So it really depends on the specific workflow and the questions that you need to answer with the data. It's not a one fits all solution. It's very, very dependent, as Brendan said, on your use case. And the providers that are out there to help you with interoperability are really serving all of those different use cases.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. And Ali, maybe back to you or Brendan or Samir, if you want to jump in. Is there, I don't know if there's a typical or most common in terms of what data exchanges you might set up. So totally hear you that, it's going to depend on your patient population, your care model, et cetera. But is there a short list that I'll say for the majority of companies you're usually starting with, these are the areas you focus?
So you really have the three large national networks: Commonwealth, Care Quality, and then the eHealth Exchange. The providers that Brendan mentioned before are really on-ramps to those. And then they kind of provide the data in different ways. So most of the kind of organizations touting interoperability are really connecting to those large organizations that are connecting across the country, or they're connecting point to point to individual hospitals or providers.
I'll jump in here too. And I think in terms of the spectrum of interoperability, like as you're starting a virtual care clinic, or a hybrid clinic, or like anything you might be trying to tackle, your prerogative is, what do I need to survive? And the first thing you need to do is claims and eligibility, like the financial. If you were doing, depending on your go-to-market motion, that may be very important. That may be vital to getting revenue. And then as you mature, you do things that are really workflow oriented. I need to prescribe labs. I need to prescribe prescriptions. So you do that. And then you hit this point where you're billing successfully. You don't have to do paper prescriptions and labs, and to some degree, hopefully. And you say, wait a minute, there's all this toil, this operational toil by operating in my small silo. Because as a virtual first care provider, you're not the Sutter Health of the world, the Kaiser Permanente with a giant enterprise and a large comprehensive multi-specialty history. You have a small sliver of your own. And that's when you come to like these on-ramps, like Ali's saying, where you say, okay, I need to access Care Quality and Commonwealth. I need to pull clinical history to do onboarding better, to do patient triage better, to do patient care and understand the prior procedures and such. So you hit that, and that's when you choose Particle, Health Gorilla, Redux Record Retrieval, No2. There's dozens of these on-ramps, but they're all intended to access these clinical networks and pull history to feed into those workflows.
I think it's also important, if I can jump onto that, there's no one size fits all solution to your interoperability needs, right? Like more likely than not, you're spanning a number of these different workflows and you're trying to solve for a number of different problems. And so, Brendan, I think to your point, at some point you're probably going to be prescribing medications or ordering labs, but then at the same time you want to complete history of the patient to be able to make those, those really informed clinical decisions. And so I think it's a matter of prioritizing those use cases, but also understanding that there really isn't a one size fits all solution out there.
Yeah, makes sense. And Brendan, just to go back to some of what you mentioned, I guess, are there any I guess, how would you characterize what interoperability needs are well solved at this point, and which, from your perspective, are still missing or challenging to address?
Yeah, I mean, I think that subset right there that I mentioned goes from already well deployed and ubiquitous to less so, right? Like claims and eligibility kind of been around for a while and largely ubiquitous, that exchange between providers and payers. And you move up and okay, so providers and labs, still ubiquitous, right? SureScripts can help you get there, but more recent in that ubiquity. And then you go further up into clinical data exchange. It's only in the past couple of years that this has really exploded at a national level. Prior to that, maybe some like hyper-focused state HIEs had some ubiquity, like North Carolina or something. But only now can you say, I can reach 75% of providers by joining Care Quality and Commonwealth. So that one's pretty good. And then we're moving more towards cutting edge stuff beyond that. Like what's prior authorization? Like how is that hitting at a point of ubiquity? What's clinical data exchange, and what's that look like to exchange that with de-identified data sets? Who's doing that and what networks exist there? I think there's more as you trend upwards beyond, let me pull clinical history and move into other problem spaces. That's where there's networks to be built. And there's things we don't even, people don't tackle them in mass. They tackle them point to point today because the network has yet to be built for many of those workflows.
I think to add a little bit, there are also some really interesting holes in the market. Medication fill data is actually remarkably hard to get, right? There's a lot of e-prescribed data out there, but the actual fill side of it is just, you'd think that would be something readily available, and that's remarkably hard to get. I think with the advent of a lot of the kind of virtual prescribing, so people using TruePill and other things like that, it's a lot easier because you're prescribing and filling at the same location. But with traditional pharmacies, the fill data is actually a big hole in the market that is probably ripe for someone to really start looking at.
Interesting.
I think also, I think Brendan, you actually touched on this just a little bit, but workflow interoperability is a super interesting opportunity to me. So right now, when we think interoperability, it's really getting data about what has already happened to the patient or what the patient has done. And I think the opportunity is thinking about like a shared care plan across multiple organizations and assigning tasks to each other and understanding what people are planning on doing with the patient as opposed to what's already been done. I haven't seen a lot of that just yet, nor do I see the capabilities of doing that in the near future.
We got a question from the audience just while we're on it. Given that fill data is a whole, I mean, are there any sources that you found to be reasonable, or have you seen any ways that people address this gap?
So I think the main way people have addressed it is the marrying of clinical data and claims data. So someone's filled a prescription if they've paid for it and their insurance has covered it. But sometimes that's incredibly delayed. Some of the pharmacies have APIs now. There's a lot more work done on that, but I've always found that a really kind of interesting space.
I would say that SureScripts medication dispense history, historically was PBM data, but now has shifted to pharmacy data and fills that gap. It's just really hard to do SureScripts, and some of the on-ramps offer it now, like Particle offers it, Zeus offers it, but it's expensive. Like SureScripts, a sort of a monopoly status, charges an arm and a leg. So yeah, medication history, and that way, like there's some cool stuff in terms of not only is it query based, but there's some alerting to say, okay, this was dispensed and it's proactively triggered to you for patients you subscribe to. Just a hard product. Like at Zeus, I was working on that for a while, and it was a really hard product to SureScripts is a difficult standards, difficult onboarding, etc. And that's the arbitrage the on-ramps have, right? The reason you pay them a tithe is because you don't want to do XML. You don't want to go through the shitty onboarding. You don't want to have to parse it into Fire. So these value add services, as well as the arbitrage, the technical arbitrage and the onboarding arbitrage, is why you're going to pay some fee to Particle, Health Gorilla, Zeus, etc.
There's I think a lot of payers also track like PDC. I forget what that is, but the days like prescription, day coverage, and that's almost a proxy of patient compliance to medications. And I wonder if that's information that folks could also kind of grab from their payer partners, and potentially even augment that with prescription SureScripts.
Got it. Wanna keep moving down the road of how to solve your interoperability needs as a digital health provider. So Samir, maybe coming back to you, just from your perspective, when does it make sense to build in-house interoperability solutions versus just buy something off the shelf?
Yeah, I think Brendan actually mentioned this and covered it really well. It's like, where do you want to put your investments in terms of build? Like if I'm, for example, a virtual care organization and I'm trying to stand up my organization to deliver care as quickly as possible, do I really need to build out my own interoperability stack, or am I purchasing tools that come with some level of that, baked into them? Essentially, has that tithe already been paid? So if I think back to, okay, what are my very specific needs? Do I have to operate my core business? Where does interoperability fit into that? And is interoperability an enabler that I've already got through my existing, investments, and it's good enough? That's a great way to start. Otherwise, now you're starting to look at prioritizing your specific use cases and building out that stack individually. And then, beyond that, I think it's, what do you want to do with the data once you have it? Are you looking at really raw data that you want to start feeding into machines and making, automating clinical decisions? Or is it really just, I want to present a complete longitudinal history to, to my users so that they can make the most informed decision possible? And I think those two levels of investment start to change. So that's where I would, again, maybe starting with what are the workflows that I'm really needing to solve for when it comes to interoperability, and have I kind of already made that investment in my existing tool?
And what do you natively get typically, and I'm sure there's variation, but what do you natively get to with like an EHR or RCM versus when do you need to actually go out and invest in one of these really specific solutions? Yeah, so from a care, I guess, from a financial perspective, your EHR/RCM solution is likely going to be able to submit claims to your payer/clearinghouse. That usually comes out of box. You don't need to go to market for that function. They'll likely be able to have they'll likely have some integration with lab vendors out there so that you can order to the national laboratories. And then what we're seeing is a huge amount of support now natively within EHRs to connect into the 3 national exchanges that we talked about: care equality, Commonwealth Health Exchange. And so that you can expect to come fairly natively. Now, are they going to then spit out raw data that you can start feeding into your analytics engine and run population level analytics? Potentially not, right? That's where you start to dive into, well, maybe we want to think about going into the going with a separate interoperability vendor. Or, I know that I'm going to get a huge amount of data. I want to comb through, curate it, and highlight the specific things that I think are going to be relevant for my specific type of care that I'm delivering. That's where you maybe want to start augmenting your stuff. Brendan, did you have someone you wanted to add, or was your hand just still up?
No, hand was just, still like, one of the drawbacks of Zoom, you never in a room, just keep your hand up like this. No, the thing I mean, Samir got it. Like EHRs are increasingly good, just like baseline plug into SureScripts, plug into the ubiquitous solutions. But if you are a builder type, on the spectrum of virtual care, if you're sort of like out of the box, let me just use it. I have a small dev team. Great. Just use what they have. But if you want to play with that data, the external data that's pulled in from the pharmacies over SureScripts, from these providers via the HIEs, it's a lot of times like locked away in a little box. It's not as accessible as like the allergies on the chart or something. So you're handicapped in what you can do and to use it across your enterprise or in like sidecar tools you might be developing. So that's the biggest like limitation, I think, generically.
So Brent, maybe staying with you. So you put together some frameworks for categorizing interoperability solutions in some of your posts. If you wouldn't mind, would love to have you just quickly walk through how you break down the solution space.
Yeah, I mean, so there's 3 roles in HIPAA, right? There's business associate, covered entity, and non-HIPAA entity. And so like which one of them someone is defines the interaction patterns they have available to them. If I'm a provider, I can use HIEs ubiquitously today. Treatment purpose of use is huge for that. There's a good interoperability primer that Particle just put out that it gets into the details of this, but as a provider, I can use these networks and pull clinical data in. And as a business associate, I might be able to use those networks on behalf of my providers that I service. So largely there's the on-ramps that sit to on-ramp you onto existing networks. There's the integrator types, the connector types like Redox or NextHealth or HealthJump, and they really help make point-to-point connections, really customized deep workflow stuff that you can't get via some generic network more easy. They give you that technical arbitrage, but in a very workflow-centric way that, you know, you don't like all the networks do one thing, right? Like I can send an e-prescription, I can retrieve a clinical document. But if I want to do deep bidirectional exchange for something, a use case like referrals or whatever it might be, you need to go build that point-to-point today until those networks develop to accommodate those workflows. So Redox, NextHealth, et cetera, the raison d'etre, whatever, to use the French. I'm working on it. And then lastly, patient access, the meaningful use, and more recently, Keeler has said patients need APIs to access their data. So very much like Plaid in banking, there's this aggregation that's occurring to aggregate all the provider APIs and aggregate all the payer APIs, which is what we do at Flexpa, and give patients and apps that face patients the ability to authenticate, type in their username and password, and pull data outside the bounds of HIPAA, right? So if I'm a non-HIPAA entity, that's primarily the main electronic mechanism I have available to me today to access data and play in this world of interoperability.
Yeah, helpful. So, Ali, let's say I decide to buy and I'm now trying to evaluate vendors in the interop space. I guess in general, how would you characterize what these vendors actually do first, and what technology and or services do they provide?
Yeah, so I think it all goes back to the workflows and what you're actually looking for. But if we talk about the on-ramp vendors to either the national networks or some of the point-to-point solutions that Brendan was just talking about, what they do is move data from one place to another. They'll find the patient, depending on the information that you have about the patient, and then they'll match that patient and pull the information back, really depending on the matching that needs to be done on the side of the EHR. So when you're looking at these solutions, again, a lot of the on-ramps and all the data that they're accessing is the same. So you really need to start looking at all the other things that some of these providers are doing. Are they cleaning the data for you? Are they providing any kind of extra help on top of that with your analytics or with your population health? What are your needs really? Do you really just need something that you can put in front of a provider to see their medical history? Do you want a user interface, or do you have developers where you actually want to build against an API solution to bring the data into your system? So it, again, very much depends on the use case in terms of how you're going to evaluate these vendors. But, really thinking about what they can do for you and how they will work with you to meet your specific use case, instead of trying to fit you into kind of what they have, is really key to evaluating these vendors.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And just following up on that, Brendan, how do you actually go about evaluating vendors that play in this space? I mean, it's often hard to just even figure out what they're doing, let alone, how to compare one against the other. So are there specific questions you ask, certain things you look for? How do you sort of think about that?
Well, I would type in Google Elion Health, and I would navigate to.
No, it's not a setup.
There we go. Yeah, the alley oop. Yeah. No, I mean, it's like how do you evaluate any vendor? It's like what are their pricing and their cost, and what problem are they solving? So let's start with problem. Like we just said, interoperability is really broad. It's a subset of problems within them. So finding the problem space they're actually trying to solve. Is it e-prescription? Is it clinical eligibility? Is it clinical data retrieval? And then finding the library of available options is surprisingly hard today. And I joke about Elion, but like hopefully that can demystify some of this and sort of orient people towards when do you go to Flexpa, or when do you go to the on-ramps, or when do you go to DoseSpot or Doctor First or whatever. And once you have that, it's just simple. Okay, like what's the pricing? Let's map them up against each other and pit them in this little cage match to try and drive down that pricing, since nobody really has transparent pricing, at least in the on-ramp world. Most of, I think historically some did, and they've retracted that. So I think you do have to engage each of them. A lot of them offer pilots and things like that to try and do some limited data retrieval and see how it functions. Most of them have the, robust developer sandboxes and toolkits to play around with. But at the end of the day, they have that core network that is the same. So there's not a huge differentiation in terms of coverage, I would say, in the hypothetical sense. I think there's ways that they each try to maximize that coverage and get the tail end of hard nodes on the care quality and Commonwealth network. I think each of them has distinct secondary networks they're trying to add into the to their data set. So for instance, Particle we mentioned has SureScripts, Zeus has SureScripts and Quest and some ADT notification. Particle also has patient ping / bamboo they've added in, and Health Gorilla has social determinants through like TransUnion or somebody. So like secondary, like bundled in offerings might be differentiating for you as a data set. But typically that's a separate problem to be solved, a separate workflow to be solved. So I think if it does align and you want two birds, one stone, that can be a differentiating feature. It also could be clutter. Like if you only want that certain clinical data, back to Ali's point earlier, you should think about like, there's a lot of different data sets. There's allergies, there's immunizations, there's labs, there's all sorts of different things you might want to focus in on, versus saying, give me all the data. Because anyone who's saying that actually doesn't know what problem they want to solve.
There's in my mind, it's almost like three categories, right? So like on the maybe low or on one end of the spectrum, you've got, speaking about the onboards or the on-ramps, just on-ramping to the network. They're not really doing much more than, getting you into the network, getting you the ability to search the network and retrieve documents. And to me, that's like, I'm a car guy, right? So the car analogy here is that's like driving a stick, right? It's just not a lot of technology between you and the and then in the middle, I think you've got folks that are building out the record locator services. They're helping you maybe automate some of that process. They're trying to give you as much of a complete record as possible, but not necessarily putting a whole bunch of processing on top of it. And that's like driving, your automatic with cruise control and like, lane assist and that sort of stuff. And then the Tesla option, like the self-driving Tesla option, is the company that's going out, grabbing all this data and now trying to munge it all together to give you the most complete record that you can, and deduplicating, aggregating that data together. So you've got this like really clean golden record. Now, does that actually exist? Can they do that? Can Tesla fully self-drive, right? But maybe not yet, but it's getting there. That being said, I think that's really kind of the way that, at least when I look at interop vendors, that's almost the way that they categorize them.
It's really helpful. And Samir, I don't know if this is you or Ali, I know you, I'm sure, focused on this a lot of Particle. Can you say a little bit more about the record locator service and how much of a source of differentiation that is for different organizations as well?
Sure. I think every interop vendor will say that their record locator is the best. It's very often when a virtual care vendor, or sorry, a virtual care solution gets information about a patient, they have minimal data on that patient. You have some basic demographics, and you have very little idea where that patient was seen. Now, for these kind of large national networks, you can't just search every single endpoint, especially for care quality. The network will collapse if you try to say, okay, was this patient seen at every possible hospital in the country? So you need to put together some sort of algorithmic way of figuring out where that patient might have records. And each vendor does it slightly differently, but it's often a geographic-based search, and then kind of searching on where you actually find some of the records. So that can be a differentiator, and again, the vendors will talk about that being a differentiator, but for the most part, kind of as Brendan mentioned, a lot of times it's finding those points at the edge of the network that is really the difference between those, and how important those kind of edge cases that might be missed with a basic geographic search is questionable. I guess the other thing to note is some of the vendors have added in recently things like, okay, well, if you know that someone has been seen somewhere, for example, for cancer care, you can add that into your search. So it's really that combination, I think, of the record locator spanning a distance based on where you live or where you've been, in addition to specific things you might know about the patient, that can really kind of combined create a really good record locator system.
All right, so we've got some more hands up, and then I'll go back to you.
Yeah, so I mean, record locator, there's two buckets, right? One is algorithmic, which is what most people have, and what Ali was talking about, and it's completely indefensible. Like, is an absolute, anyone says, oh, like, we have the best algorithm and it's better than anyone else's, there's no unique asset there. It's just a question of time that people converge on it. There's only so many levers to pull. So I think like that part of RLS, when you start, you have a real shit one. And you search the state, or you search 100 miles, but then you add secondary addresses and you add, X, Y, or Z, like you search the state HIEs or the closest Epic site. Like there's all these levers that, frankly, I should just put in a tweet or something so it's public knowledge. And then the differentiated RLS, which only really hypothetically SureScript has, is I have enough patient lives. I see enough volume. It's the economies of scale that give me a unique insights into where patients have been seen before, such that I can search. I say, Brendan's lived in California, Brendan's lived in New Jersey, Brendan's lived in the Netherlands. Let me search all those places except for the Netherlands, because I can. And so then by the virtue of the scale of my data asset, I have a unique RLS, and that can do better hypothetically. But it's super hard to prove that without pilots and things like that. So the last thing I'll say about RLS is that it is a pure play function of how care quality was designed. In the ideal world, the most effective RLS is you search every node every time. And if we switch to TEFCA, the new care quality copy with a few slight differences, where there's a few QHINs, main players, instead of thousands of nodes, RLS becomes not a differentiator. I can search every QHIN every time. So anyone that's pointing, saying, we got the best RLS, it's like, ooh, that's quicksand, buddy. Yeah, that's my only thought there.
So, Samir.
Yeah. One thing to add there, I think there's a really interesting opportunity with payers, because to a certain degree, the payer has a pretty good table of contents of where they've paid for care and where other payers have also paid for care. And so, with folks like Flexpa now giving access to patients and payer data, there's an amazing opportunity, and I was talking about this with someone recently, to leverage that payer data, not necessarily for the clinical content, but more so just where has the patient been, where they paid for care, and then use that as a baseline for where you want to go searching for records.
Interesting. Ali, do you want to jump back in?
Yeah, one more thing to add that, I think we haven't really talked about any of the state-based HIEs, and I think we'll get to that in a bit, but also how Commonwealth works is really without an RLS. So if you have a master patient index where you actually know where patients have been seen, there's no need to do kind of a search based on what you're guessing. So, for example, the way the HIE works in New York, there is a master patient index that feeds in records and demographics from across New York State and actually tracks where each patient has a record, so that when a patient is queried, you don't have to search for them in, across somewhere where you don't know they've been seen. You can actually say, oh, actually, we know there are records in these 10 places. Let's just go to these 10 places. That's the way the Commonwealth works as well, where you feed in information on where a patient has been. You can also search, kind of across care quality from within Commonwealth, but the world where we do have kind of that master list of where people have been kind of negates the need for something like a record locator service.
This is actually probably a good point maybe to jump ahead, Ali, if you wouldn't mind giving an overview. We're talking a lot about Commonwealth, care quality, e-health exchange, state HIEs. For folks who aren't as familiar with this world, do you mind just quickly breaking it down and helping folks understand what these are and what the differences are?
Absolutely. So this goes back to, I think, some of the what is interoperability that Brendan was talking about at the beginning. When we talk about HIEs, we really use it both as a verb and a noun. I read that somewhere a couple of years ago, and it's really stuck with me. You use HIE as the verb in that the act of sharing health information. And you also use HIE as a noun, as in the organization that is helping you share information. So first thing first, when you're talking about HIE, should qualify whether you're actually talking about an organization that is an HIE or really the act of exchanging data. But really what an HIE is, if you're talking about the noun, which is really what we're talking about here, is an organization or a company that is exchanging data, or that is an intermediary in exchanging data. So, care quality is a framework for HIE. Commonwealth is an HIE itself. You have state HIEs, which are much more kind of geographically focused. So you'll have something like in New York, the Statewide Health Information Network of New York, that is really comprised of hospitals connected to the same entity. When you're thinking about HIE in general, thankfully people have started to change that to be talking about HINs, or health information networks, which really encompasses the actual organizations that are either providing on-ramps, or the exchange-based organizations, or are really connecting organizations across the spectrum.
Super helpful. Brendan, Samir, anything you want to add to that? Just quickly.
You covered it really well.
I think the biggest question mark in this space is still, what is the role of state HIEs, of these regional HIEs that were the predecessors of now the increasingly dominant nationwide networks? And I think that's an interesting question to posit to them. And like, what services do they offer that are uniquely differentiated against this sort of generic, more ubiquitous wide exchange? They can be an on-ramp themselves, and many are joining care quality and Commonwealth. They can offer types of interoperability that are not possible via the nationwide networks. And that's certainly some things we've seen, like some have ADT notifications, some have, maybe like prior auth. I don't know, like I don't know where they're going, but they're all trying to do things that are differentiated. But it's a big question mark, because the federal government made the decision to sort of back the care quality as a idea, as a way of operating, versus sort of a competing idea where the consortium of HIEs said, we're going to do this decentralized regional HIE-centric alerting between these nodes. So I think it's still in flux. It's a really interesting problem space to look at, and solution space, especially for virtual care organizations that are state specific, which is most of them. Many don't have national scale because of competition or just licensure problems. So what unique capabilities are available for my state HIE if I'm in North Carolina or New York or wherever, any ones that have halfway decent HIEs, which is not the case for many states, but that's okay. Like, you should just evaluate and know your geography and know what's available.
Samir, did you want to jump back in?
Yeah. So I think to that point, the frameworks and the way that the data is even stored is completely different between these two models. And so you have, data, there's no like magic cloud in the sky that has everybody's health data in it across the country, right? That's not really how care quality works. So in that model, the data is still residing with typically the source, the health system. And so today, there's no really good way of saying, find me all patients that, have an A1C greater than whatever in a certain region, or that are on a certain medication or something like that. But you actually do have that opportunity with the regional HIEs, where they are collecting the data from, multiple disparate sources, but normalizing it, aggregating it, and then making that kind of longitudinal chart available, to downstream consumers, and then enabling that kind of population health or analytics based workflow.
So interesting.
I think another benefit of the state HIEs, and I'm somewhat biased having worked for a state HIE for a very long time, is the identification of your trading partners and really and the completeness of records. So if you are two hospital systems within the same geographic area that always refer back and forth, or you're a specialist in New York City and all the hospitals you're working with are also in New York City, you can, there aren't as many unknowns in terms of what records are coming back. It's easier to manage your referrals if you're really all reading off of the same information. When you're using the large national networks, again, you're not necessarily knowing who you're getting the data from, and your patients may not know where they've been seen, and you're trying to get as wide a swath of data as you can to hope for completeness. When you're really acting in a smaller geographic area and you're working with a state HIE, you're going to know more about your data. You're going to know more about the trading partners that you have, who you're referring to, who's referring back to you, and you're going to know a lot more about how complete that data set is. I've lived in New York for most of my life. Most of my records are here. My providers can pull my records knowing that they're somewhat of a complete set. Whereas if they're pulling it across the national networks, yes, I've lived in some other places a few times years ago, and I've been to the emergency room in different places, but is that information important? I think with the state HIEs, you have a bit more confidence in the completeness and importance of the information itself.
And Brendan, just to round out the conversation on HIEs and HINs, can you just give a quick overview of what TEFCA is and what QHINs are?
Yeah, Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement is a piece of the Cures Act. So Congress passes Cures Act in 2016, becomes the Cures Rule, the ONC Cures Rule by virtue of that act. And in it, there was many things. It said, let's update EHR certification. There's this thing called information blocking, and you must establish a nationwide health information network. And so they took that and they made TEFCA. TEFCA is largely copy pasting care quality, saying we're going to exchange CDAs, at least to start. We're going to have a trusted framework with rules, and instead of implementers, we're going to have QHINs, qualified health information networks, who are the on-ramps, who exist to sit and follow the rules and flow down the appropriate rules to the people that connect to them. It is a voluntary mechanism, right? You say, I'm going to go join QHIN as a QHIN or another role, and I'm going to join as it launches. So 9 QHINs have put their hat in the ring. I think 8 are publicly known. So Epic, notably, as an EHR, Health Gorilla from the on-ramp category, and then a variety of others, NextGen, I think eHealth Exchange and Commonwealth, regardless. So they're all QHINs and they're gearing up. So what's the big change? The same standards, so the same benefits of near ubiquity and support from various vendors, and largely the same structure, not centralized, et cetera. There's two main things. One is there's a new purpose of use, patient access. Patients can identify themselves, say, take a selfie, do different things to strongly use this NIST standard to prove their identity and then pull their records. That's a big change. And that opens up, selling to pharma. It opens up selling to anyone that can get a patient, get consent, have them prove themselves, their identity. They could pull records. So every on-ramp is sort of looking like, oh my God, the TAM there. rightfully. And there's also, if you're into patient access, it's really cool. Today, I have to log into each patient portal to pull my records. If I could just prove I'm Brendan Keeler and pull from, every MyChart in America or whatever, every Epic site, it's better than logging into every MyChart in America. So that's one. It also has baked in a little push mechanism. So instead of just pulling, instead of using direct trust, another nationwide network to push, that's ubiquitous today, but it's kind of a mess in terms of its directory. Now it's all consolidated into the TEFCA. So I can push via TEFCA and I can pull like I can via care quality. So that's potentially powerful, but the voluntary nature of it means that it's really uncertain without further regulation or pushes from the ONC or other bodies, how we'll get to the end state where it's, what people use instead of care quality. So yeah, I think the future is uncertain. I think it's exciting for a variety of reasons, but it's not as clear cut as everyone, I think, makes it out to be.
Super helpful. I want to go back just for a second. There's something we skipped over that I think we've got a question about as well. So, we've talked a lot about, Samir, coming to you, a lot about how do we pull, data, but I think there's a lot of questions about, once you get this data, you're going to have duplications, you're going to have errors, you're going to have gaps, you're going to have all sorts of issues. And so I know this is, a huge topic in and of itself, but do you have any high-level suggestions for builders, as they're gathering all this data to mitigate these challenges and actually make the data useful?
I mean, like, my non-answer here is try to avoid it if at all possible, frankly. Like, semantic interoperability is a massive issue. And what I mean by that is, understanding that you've got different facilities that are using different code sets potentially, or using the same code sets, but they're using them differently. Or the interpretation of the standards that are being used underneath the covers is slightly different between EHR vendors and so on and so forth. So what ends up happening is you've got this sort of technical lift of homogenizing all this data together. But then you've got this problem of just data duplication as well. If a patient has a peanut allergy, for example, and they report to all the providers, you're going to get X number or N number of instances of that peanut allergy, but it's also going to be coded different. It might be captured different at the source. And so now how do you take that and present that in like a usable format to the user? So can you avoid that problem altogether? Is it really important to have a unified, totally like sanitized view of the record, or is it okay that it's a little dirty and your providers are really going to be going in, glancing at the data, trying to figure, block out the pieces of information or input that they need, and then move along in their workflow? If that's the case, maybe don't invest so much in trying to get completely clean, 100% well aggregated data. I think that's number one. Number two, if that is an important issue, like, work with somebody that has been doing this for a lot longer than you have, right? So there are on-ramps that are investing in really making this function better, if not perfect, at least better. And so start to leverage those investments instead of trying to build it on your own. And then I think the final thing is really just thinking about it from a UX perspective. Even if you're presenting unclean data, is the user experience around showing that data relatively good? Does it fit naturally within the workflow? Are users able to kind of consume that data visually, at least, relatively easily? If that's make your investments there as opposed to trying to really solve this gnarly problem of data sanitization underneath the covers. Ali, Brendan, I'd love to hear what you guys think here as well.
Yeah, I guess my one piece of advice to everyone on this call is do not try and build your own master patient index. There are plenty of organizations doing that. And when you're dealing with a patient's health data, you really want to err on the side of not mismatching patients. I think we've all probably encountered times and places where data has been mismatched, and a master patient index is an incredibly complex thing to build from scratch. If you're going to buy one piece of software, and this could be a whole other topic, but work with a vendor that has a good master patient index or is relying on a good master patient index to merge data. Or as Samir was saying, just accept that your data might not be merged and that that's okay, because you really don't want to start mixing up patients and mistakenly giving information on a patient to another patient, or you're just mixing up diagnoses. So master patient index is something, and I have tried to build one from scratch. It's incredibly complicated, time consuming, and there have been a lot of people who have done it before. Don't try to do that.
Yeah, I've done it. It's fine, but it's just it's not fulfilling work, right? It's not, you're like a matching demographics. Oh, let's use probabilistic, and you're reading papers by the highest order academics at Stanford about patient matching. You're like, why am I doing this all again? I would love to see these algorithms open sourced, just saying, what are the common ways you might use it? Because even if I published exactly what an Epic site used for their matching, because they have pretty robust patient matching MPI built in, you wouldn't be able to use it. You just the principles you would use and build into your own that's more suited to your populations. So I think that the fact that people hold this as proprietary is so silly. It's one of the silliest things in the entire industry, and it's really, really grunt work. It's once you build and ship it and it works, it's cool, but it's just a pain.
We have a few minutes left here, so I want to get to some of the pre-submitted Q&A. So Samir, for you, what are some ways to avoid cutting into margins too heavily when scaling interfaces or interoperability across new customers?
Yeah, I would say leverage vendors with economies of scale. So if you need to make direct point-to-point connections, somebody like Redox that has done 1 billion of them already is your friend, right? And so leverage a vendor that's like that to be able to to do those quickly. Leverage standards wherever possible. You don't want to build custom APIs with everybody that you're trading with unless you absolutely have to. And then again, I would say don't over engineer or over solve the problem. This data enables your workflows. These are not your workflows. So so think about your core workflow first, and how do you enrich and enhance that, and do that, and don't do much more.
Ali, coming to you. So one of the questions we got is, are patient access APIs a viable source of external clinical data at this point? Are there vendors who have solved this problem and are able to locate records and get patient approval? And what data is available by these means compared to care quality?
So what's interesting is it's not a technical problem, right? The pipes all work for patient access. It's not that you can't use something like care quality for patient access. It's not like the record location is really any different. It's that you're not going to get responses back if you are calling one of these networks for patient access. So there are some vendors who have solved it, for example, using Smart on Fire to access endpoints. But in that case, you need usernames and passwords. You need to re-authenticate. So it's hard to do. But the patient access issue, which Brendan talked a little bit about before with TEFCA, it's not a technical issue. It's not an on-ramp issue. It's a kind of a regulation and a forcing hospitals and providers to actually respond to patient access queries. So as soon as people sign on to TEFCA, one of the things that they're doing when they sign on to TEFCA is committing to respond to these patient access queries within, I think, 6 months. So once that is done using the frameworks that already exist, patient access will open up relatively quickly. It's just that forcing mechanism on the response side that is missing from patient access.
Brendan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah. And Ali said it good about the future of patient access through TEFCA. That's why people are jazzed about it, because today, what can I do? I can have the patient log into their provider portals to aggregate the FHIR for APIs that were mandated via cures and put in place hypothetically as of December last month. I can also access the payer APIs that were made available via the July 2021 CMS regulation, not explicitly tied to cures, but thematically tied to cures. And that is what Flexpa does. We aggregate those. So what can I get via patient access APIs? If I'm a provider org, there's no reason I can get provider data over care quality and COML with very little friction. I could milk additional clinical data potentially through patient access APIs for the provider sites that are not on care quality or COML. That's the diff there. And then I can access claims data. Claims data is not on the HINs. So if I want that, patient access could give me, a road to that. So for provider orgs, some very mature, again, in that spectrum of maturity of virtual care, after they've done the HIEs, they say, how can I get more data, more clinical data, or how can I get claims data to give provider to give some care navigation type capabilities to say, hey, you've been going to X, Y, and Z and you're overspending, or to get that perspective to guide patients in a financial sense. That might be a use case for like really mature digital providers might look at claims data via these APIs. But largely, you're going to start by using the HIEs to get clinical data because there's so much less friction. And until you've done that really well, you wouldn't move to go use patient access for anything as a digital provider organization.
And there needs to be incentive for the patient to actually do that, right? So if I'm a patient and I'm onboarding into a new provider and I can use my patient access APIs to fill out my pre-visit questionnaires, that's a huge incentive, right? And that starts driving usage. But until that happens, why would a patient even go other than just genuine curiosity of what their clinical history is like, which they have access to in the other portals anyways.
Makes sense. Maybe last question to wrap up, Brendan. So one audience member asks, just interested in hearing the state of reality on interoperability versus current compliance by EHRs and providers.
Yeah. So the EHRs, you can go to the certified EHR list and search and see they did surprisingly well. Let's give a round of applause for at least complying on paper. The actual, and I've only dabbled because we're hyper focused on payers at Flexpa, but I love to play around with APIs, you know me. So I've gone to some of the major EHRs that didn't have really early compliance, like Epic's had it around for a while, Cerner's had it around for a while. So I went to Meditech, eClinicalWorks, et cetera. I think it's a mixed bag. They're all there on paper, and then you start to poke at it, and some of them are going to the cement needs to settle. They need to have some reps. They need to get their processes in place with their developer programs. But by and large, you can go and search for your favorite EHRs on the CHPL link, CHPL, and then see who's compliant. And I think this year is going to be rolling that out to all providers. So I'm optimistic, or I'm surprised if I had to use one adjective on how they did.
Great. Well, maybe we'll wrap up on that optimistic note then. Just want to say a huge thank you to the panelists. You guys were all fantastic. So really appreciate it, and really appreciate everyone joining today. One last plug to just go check out Elion at elion.health and sign up for our mailing list just to stay in the loop as we release additional content and webinars like this. Otherwise, thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.